Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Suppose that the U.S. becomes a reliable and consistent exporter of natural gas and crude oil. How much impact will our natural gas exports have on the geopolitical issues relative to how much impact our diplomatic and military policies have on those geopolitical issues? Does anyone care to take that?
I mean, I could just say that because these oils within relative bounds kind of trade as like types of oil, as I've been talking about, you do have to look at the geopolitics and the kinds of oil that we would be exporting. So the light tight oil, as I mentioned earlier, has backed Nigerian imports out of the U.S. As we've produced more of that oil, we are importing now no oil from Nigeria. We're still importing oil, but it's just not from Nigeria. Well, that has a geopolitical impact, say, on Nigeria. And I think even though oil's not being used at all as a weapon, it ends up being something that can counteract the peacekeeping and the other efforts that we have in these very fragile nations around the world. Venezuela was mentioned. I mean,
right.
there's...
I'm thinking in particular of Russia and Mr. Putin. Will our exports have more impact on his behavior than our military or diplomatic activities?
It's a really good question, but I do think that Russia is reeling from the price of oil.
Right.
So it's not our exports that are really changing what's going on in Russia right now. It's $60 a barrel oil that's changing what's going on in Russia right now, which is a much bigger demand question. That's not about our exports.
If I could weigh in on that, sir. The problem we have is twofold. We've had a lot of very, I think impassioned proposals to do something to help Ukraine with the Russian crisis, but and other geopolitical events. But the reality is, of course, that our oil and gas are owned by private companies, and they are likely to ship the oil or gas, oil if we allowed it, to where the market gives them the greatest profit. Right now, although it's changing before us as I speak, it's always been assumed that the market for LNG primarily would be in the Far East, because the premiums there have been much higher than those in Europe, although now we have LNG prices crashing in Asia down to very low levels where it's even questionable whether we can deliver LNG into some of those markets competitively by the time we actually have LNG people ready to go, outside contracts that have already been signed. Geopolitically, I think the issue of exports is extremely important. Our allies in Korea and Japan and Taiwan are very desirous to have energy from the United States because they see an increasingly bellicose China threatening sea lanes on which all their energy imports come from, not only oil and gas, but also coal. So they're delighted, and I think it does improve our diplomatic status to the extent that we send energy there. But again, these are going to be commercial choices made by the companies that own that oil and gas.
Well, clearly that was a complicated question.
Excuse me?
It was clearly a complicated question.
It's very complicated.
Well, how much, whoever can answer this, how much do you see oil exports increasing? How do you see oil exports increasing over time if we were to repeal the Energy Policy and Conservation Act? Do we see a large bump, or do we see a slow increase? How do we see that playing out?
Well, EIA is, we do tend to look at those in our annual energy outlooks, which we do every year. We'll have that one out, we hope, sometime in late February or March. The answer to that, I think, probably lies more towards the lower end rather than the upper end. The reason I say that is that the kind of oil that we have in surplus here is a light sweet crude. The market for that is not unlimited. So the question is how much of that could be put out onto the global markets before you saturated the global markets. Something on the order of 1 million or 1.5 million barrels a day might be the number that would be exported.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.